First things first, I'd like to thank the extremely beautiful Jeremy for gifting me this game. He's an exceptionally good human, and I'm glad to call him my friend. Thank you, buddy. You're one in a million. I think the best way to review this is by exposing sections of detail, as I feel Firewatch's experience can vary depending on how much or how little you know about the game. With that in mind, let's start. Hello. If you know nothing about Firewatch outside the original trailer at E3 and are watching this review, then I recommend not watching much further. Here is your detail and spoiler-free recommendation. Should you play Firewatch? Yes. Because I think Firewatch is a game best played as blind as possible. I would say that going out now and playing it before reading up on it, here or anywhere else, is the best course of action. Any more knowledge of the game may ruin your experience. So go forth. Play that vidya. If you absolutely need to know more about the game, the next part of the video will do a more detailed, but still spoiler-free review. Otherwise, go enjoy yourself. Alright, are they gone? For those of you who may know a little bit more about Firewatch and are looking for a spoiler-free review, or possibly are not sold on the game and want more information, here's your bit. Firewatch is a game about a man named Henry, who takes a job as a fire lookout after the Yellowstone fires of 1998. Once in his position, he is put in contact with his supervisor, Delilah. These two characters take a front seat to the action as the story of Henry's employment begins to unfold. Firewatch is an adventure game in the best sense of the genre. It is more than just a walking simulator. You have a very well-designed land to explore, and while there is no action to speak of, it never felt like this is some artsy BS crammed into the confines of a gaming experience. There really aren't any puzzles to encounter that impede your progress either. This is a game driven by character development. Henry and Delilah are interesting characters, and the small cast of minor characters that happen through the game are engaging as well. On the technical side, almost everything done by Firewatch is first class. Beautiful graphics and art design, fantastic script, and absolutely top-notch voice acting. Both Henry and Delilah are voiced impeccably. They let the emotion of their voice tell when the cracks in their armor start to show. They feel real. They feel like real humans. Even the minor characters have enough detail put into them to make them feel well-rounded. Although I would say one of their roles gets shafted more than it should, however, there are reasons for that, and I'll get to a greater discussion about that once we're in spoiler territory. I am somewhat frustrated that I cannot define this game's art style correctly. When I peer out from Henry's lookout tower, I am reminded heavily of old science fiction pulp art. Think about John Carter film posters or some of what has been seen from No Man's Sky for recent examples. In fact, the font used in Firewatch reminds me heavily of the font used in No Man's Sky. Granted, this game has exactly zero sci-fi elements, but the way the colors of orange and red, and to a lesser extent, green and blue, are used screams old-school science fiction to me. None of this is more striking than the backdrop of the mountains, styled in a two-tone color design. It makes me think I'm looking at old sci-fi pulp covers at an antique bookstore. There is a definite sense of nostalgia from this art style. And maybe I'm not far off in seeing the influence relate to Firewatch. A lot of sci-fi pulp deals with the main character being placed in a strange, and literally, alien world. It could be said that this is what happens to Henry, as his new job puts him in environments he's never been in before, devoid of most common comforts the real world has given him. I may be drawing connections where there are none, but I don't think I'm exactly grabbing at straws. The Shoshone Forest is as much of a character as Henry and Delilah are. It's sprinkled with lively landmarks, most of which can be expounded upon by Delilah if the player so requests. You can pick up and examine items you find along the way as well, although most of the time you're just going to be identifying if it is indeed wood. The environment feels alive. At a small handful of points in the game, the soundtrack will play a mellow, yet still folksy sounding song, and it never takes away from the feeling of immersion. If anything, it only adds to it. The only knock I may have is that when climbing up and down outcroppings of rock, there's only ever one animation. I would have liked to have seen a couple different rock pairings or climbing animations to keep immersion, but whatever, I'm being a finicky dork. I still don't want to say anything at all about the story, because I think it's so vital to experience it with no previous knowledge, but hopefully, by delving out some of these basic and technical details, I've given a better case for the game. So, let's review. Should you play Firewatch? Yes. This is not a long game. Steam only clocked in my playthrough at 4 hours, but gosh dang man, it was a memorable experience. I loved how alive the forest felt. I loved the sparse soundtrack. I loved the characters, and I loved the art style. It's definitely not perfect, but if you don't know the plot to Firewatch, then I highly recommend grabbing a game and playing through it. So with that out of the way, this is your absolute last warning. I've given 2 reviews for the game that are still technically spoiler-free. This last section of the game is going to cover the game's story as well as my thoughts on the plotline and character developments. I must stress how important I feel it is to play the game blind, so going any further in this review may jeopardize your experience. If you still plan on playing the game, please stop here. Alright, are they gone? Alright people, let's do this. Firewatch starts off with some small intermittent walking sequences cut between a story told in text. The story is of Henry and how he meets Julia in 1975. Throughout the years, Henry and Julia fall in love, get married, get a dog, and other things. Julia eventually gets the onset of early dementia. The story sequence ends with her condition being very poor. There are a couple choices during this story sequence, their effects being presumably minor, as they look to change some small details. The game starts off proper, with Henry making his way to his lookout post and meeting a woman named Delilah via radio. She plays coy, saying there must be something wrong with Henry for him to want to take this job. It's always something like that. Henry doesn't really play along, as he's tired from hiking for 2 days. The next morning, Delilah tries to brief Henry on his job when she spots fireworks in the west, telling Henry he needs to investigate. Delilah and Henry chat frequently throughout the travel, as you can report whatever you find back to Delilah over the radio. When meeting the culprits, the teens tell Henry he probably has a tiny dick literally 3 sentences into meeting him. Great writing. On the way back, we get more interactions with Delilah, like her telling us that she was drunk last night when Henry got to his post. Delilah is snarky and witty, with a hint of jadedness. Not unlikable, though. When he gets back to his lookout tower, he finds his typewriter outside. Something that can't happen naturally. When he gets upstairs, he finds his lookout vandalized and ransacked. Henry and Delilah discuss the severity of what happens. The next morning, the phone line appears to go out, most likely from last night's storm. Delilah asks Henry to go check if the line is down north of the canyon. While on the way, I turn the conversation to Julia being at home and me being here, even though I shouldn't. Delilah is sympathetic. I wanted to see if the game was going to use Henry's job as a catalyst for dealing with Julia's condition. Henry finds the downed wire, and upon further inspection, sees that it was deliberately cut. More beer cans and a pair of panties with bad messages on it tell us that it was most likely the teens from before. Delilah gets mad as hell, wishing Henry to go find them and wreck their camp. Henry is off to go find his way back and maybe spot a trail of the teens. On the way, Henry finds a backpack belonging to a Brian Goodwin. Delilah remarks that she knows who that is. Brian, a 12-year-old, and his dad, Ned, were rangers 3 summers ago, but left halfway through the summer. She does not know why. His backpack was found suspended haphazardly by a dead tree. There are cut ropes above, and it doesn't look like a good sign. Henry and Delilah spot a smoke plume out in the distance. They reckon it is a campfire from the teens. Henry runs off to investigate. On the way, Delilah asks what Julia has, and Henry explains about Julia's Alzheimer's in more detail. Coming up on 5 Mile Creek, Henry finds signs of the teenage girls, eventually finding their campsite and his bedsheets, confirming that they indeed broke in. He finds their campsite torn to shreds, and a note from them accusing Henry of creeping on them and stealing their shit and stuff. It's kinda whacked out. At this point in the game, time begins to skip, so days or even weeks will go by before the game picks back up. A week after seeing the teen girls' campground destroyed, Delilah tells her that 2 young girls have been reported missing while camping. The 2 wonder if it was the troublemaking girls they ran into. A week later, Henry is woken up in the middle of the night by Delilah. Julia is on the telephone line. Her and Henry briefly chat, but the conversation literally goes nowhere, since it's like midnight, 3 a.m., something like that. 2 weeks later, Henry is off to go pick up a supply drop. Henry tells him that 2 weeks ago, Henry called her on the radio and pretended to have a conversation with Julia. They talk about it, with Delilah telling a story about dating a man named Javier before she got this job. They dated for 5 years, and she was ready to marry him at the drop of a hat. But one summer, Javier's brother died, and Delilah didn't leave the post to be with him. She quips that Javier said it would be easier doing the funeral and everything solo, but when she got back, he left her. She lied to her sister, saying Javier banged the neighbor, but she's been lying about this for 10 years now, only now telling Henry. A month later, Henry and Delilah observe a large fire many miles down in the forest. You have the choice of what to name the fire, and I chose the Flapjack Fire. I only bring this up because it makes it easier to reference later on. Henry and Delilah discuss the fire, and Delilah more and more seems to be coming on to Henry as the conversation unfolds. Maybe she's drunk. The conversation choices could have easily turned this talk romantic/sexual. A little more than a week down the road, an idyllic Henry is off to go fish himself some dinner, and he guesses that he'll keep an eye out for this quote-unquote problem bear they've been having in the area. This all goes pear-shaped, as once Henry gets down to the lake, he finds a clipboard out in the open. When he starts reading it, he discovers that someone has transcripts of Henry and Delilah's radio conversations. He also finds a walkie-talkie lying nearby that says Wapiti Station. He just finishes reading it when suddenly he's hit from behind until knocked unconscious. Needless to say, the game just kicked into high gear. Delilah doesn't know anything about a Wapiti Station, but says that there's an area to the north called Wapiti Meadow. Henry tries to explore the area, but is stopped by large fencing. Both Henry and Delilah are at a loss, since neither of them were aware of something and someone being in this area. Unable to get past the locked gate, Delilah remembers that there were firefighters stationed south near the Ruby River. When Henry gets there, he finds an empty camp, as they've all finished and left the scene. Luckily, he finds an axe to help with the door, and a memo stating that Wapiti Station is a research zone of sorts. The mercury rises as Henry and Delilah discuss the possibility that Wapiti Station is researching them. Just when you think the overwhelming paranoia couldn't be topped, Delilah and Henry hear a cough over the radio. A cough neither of them made. A couple days pass, until Delilah starts talking to Henry in code, asking him to hike to Cottonwood Creek. Once there, Henry finds a new, hopefully untapped, walkie-talkie placed by Delilah. In one of the best scenes in the game, Henry and Delilah try to make sense of what's going on. Henry goes through a bit of a breakdown and thinks that he may be going through early dementia, just like Julia was. Henry breaks the gate into Wapiti Station and hustles inside. There's a comm tower, gridded off soil plot, and various bulky machinery. Inside the tent, Henry finds an assortment of documents and scientific instruments. He picks up a wave receiver device that leads him to a black box and a note full of observations about Henry and Delilah. Delilah goes into a fit of rage, saying that Henry should burn down the research site. Ironically, as Henry's leaving the site, it catches fire and burns up. The two decide to report it as usual. Later that night, Henry's wave receiver starts going off. He goes to track down what's picking up, and Delilah tracks down and picks up a bottle of tequila. Henry turns his radio off, which seems really stupid if you ask me, and tracks down the source of the problem. The source is coming from a backpack, which ends up being booby-trapped by an alarm. I was spooked. However, inside the backpack are keys to the Shoshone Cave near Henry's tower, a locked-off cave that had its keys go missing a long time ago. On the way back, Delilah remarks that at least Henry made it back to his tower, but Henry is still in the woods. He rushes back to the tower. There's a Walkman taped to the door. The audio cassette is Delilah and Henry talking hours earlier about lighting the site on fire to deal with whoever's tracking them. The tape is edited in such a manner that it frames Delilah as the one whose idea it was to burn down the research site, something neither of them actually did. Side note, Delilah reports seeing someone in Henry's tower as I am in viewing distance of the tower itself. Either there was no one there and Delilah is setting Henry up, or the game didn't think that I would be in view of Henry's tower by the time that audio segment played. At this time, I was leaning more towards the first idea of Delilah being unreliable / possibly on their side. There is already grounds to see Henry as an unreliable narrator, as we see Julia's phone call from his view, which was incorrect to Delilah's retelling. With paranoia at max cap, this unintentionally makes for one of the best parts of the game. Delilah wakes up to inform Henry that someone masquerading as him said Delilah knows what caused the site fire, so the other lookouts have been questioning her. It very much looks like Delilah is being set up to take the fall for the arson. Henry goes off to explore the cave. Once he enters the cave, someone runs by to slam and lock the door behind him. This should confirm that someone is actually out here. Henry is able to find his way through the cave, exit, and report back to Delilah on what happens. Once outside, he finds a small outcropping that looks like a hideout for the young kid, Brian Goodwin. Side note, multiple caches around the forest have had copies of Richard Sturgeon novels, all I've seen in recent memory being a series about a spy detective named Neil Black. One of these books is found alongside a comic book, obviously belonging to Brian. Ned may be the one who owns / reads all these Richard Sturgeon, Neil Black novels. It's a nice touch that gives a bit more background to one of the minor characters. There are various documents in this hideout, mainly paraphernalia from Brian. There's something about ham radio bouncing off meteorites that both Brian and Ned seem to work on. In the hideout, Henry finds Brian had stole all of Ned's climbing equipment and stashed them here, so Ned would stop trying to teach Brian how to climb. With the equipment in tow, Henry is now able to explore deeper into the cave. On the way back to the cave, Delilah mentions that the 2 girls from the beginning were found. They went joyriding on some farmer's tractor and wound up in jail. In the cave, Henry spots a figure. Getting closer, he realizes it's a slightly rotting body of Brian Goodwin, who fell down this cave when his rope snapped. Henry gets out of the cave and reports Brian Goodwin's body to Delilah. She takes the news extremely hard, because Brian wasn't supposed to be with Ned on his Firewatch duty. It's illegal. Delilah mentioned that a while back she lied to cover Brian being out here when someone thought they spotted a kid. She thinks that if she would not have done that, or allowed Brian to be here in the first place, he wouldn't be dead in the cave. She takes the death on her hands, even though she shouldn't. Delilah says to Henry to just head back and pack up. The flapjack fire is spreading towards them, and they should be evac'd by tomorrow. After spending the morning packing up, the wave receiver goes off, and Henry and Delilah decide to track it down. What they find may clear Delilah's name. Delilah seemed kind of pushy to get Henry to find it, which was originally kind of suspect sounding, but when you realize that her name is on the line for arson, it makes a lot more sense. The past 2 days, the flapjack fire has been cooking out more and more smoke. Today, it's hard to even see around the top of the lookout. The receiver leads to a tracking collar with a cassette tape, specifically for Henry. It's a tape made by Ned Goodwin, who has some relatively vague words about cutting a new life and bumping into him back at the beginning of the game. He says he's been living here in the Shoshone for 3 years, keeping cozy, but he's run out of books to read. I knew the books were his. He's the one listening in on Delilah and Henry. He says Brian died in a climbing accident. He was teaching him how to climb, but Brian didn't sink his anchor right. When Ned thought about going back and reporting the body and burying Brian, it looks like he'd rather just stay out here in the Shoshone. There's a rope left for Henry. After climbing it, Henry finds a makeshift underground hideout where Ned was living. Some of Brian's old things and items possibly stolen from the teen girls' camp are found within. Ned was the one who wrote up all those Henry and Delilah notes. There's also radio logs of Henry and Delilah talking to each other. Sidebar. So most documents you come across in this game, you can take with you if you so choose. I wondered if the fact that I've been able to take all the documents I've had with me will help clear Delilah's name at the end of the game for the arson. As Henry's telling Delilah about Ned's base of operations, he quips about the flapjack fire most likely wiping all of this out. Delilah says, well, take a picture, in a really condescending manner. But, if you remember, you got Brian's camera way back in day 2, and you can take pictures with it. So I took enough pictures of the base in hope that the game had a win/fail state where I had enough evidence to clear Delilah for the arson. Henry makes for Delilah's lookout, as the evacuation spot is there. Once there, he finds out Delilah has already left. They discuss over radio what the next steps in their lives are going to be, as neither of them will want to come back to do another summer of this. There are choices for what Henry tells Delilah, so I told her, go to Santa Fe. Delilah told me to go back to Julia and see if I could put that typewriter of mine to good use. I have a sinking feeling that Delilah's answer is based on your conversation choices. The helicopter lands, and Henry sees the first human of the game, a rescue personnel who helps him into the helicopter. The end. During the credits, any pictures you took with Brian's camera will scroll down the credit screen, eventually showing the picture Henry took of himself on accident, and the pictures Ned and Brian took during their time here. Where to begin with this? The main issue with Firewatch is that it's a game that's heavily based on character development, but its story is what starts pulling the weight after a while. The beginning of Firewatch is more or less a collection of small to medium happenstances, such as the rowdy teenage campers, to picking up the ranger supply drops. These events give Henry and Delilah the opportunities needed to explore each other's characters. This is good because their characters and interactions are the main draw of the game. However, a couple plot points begin to congeal into one larger plot line, and that mark of the game is when Firewatch stops being about Henry and Delilah exploring the successes and failures of their character and starts being about Henry and Delilah in a paranoia-filled, high-stakes thriller. This isn't bad in and of itself, because the moments that Henry finds himself in quickly become tense and suspenseful. Moments like being knocked out near Lake Jonesy, hearing the cough on the radio line, and the alarm-trapped backpack are nerve-shattering moments of shock and suspense. This, alongside moments like Delilah spotting someone in Henry's tower, is where the trust in Delilah and Henry start to wane. Are they reliable? Can you trust that Delilah is an innocent part in the social experiment they think they found themselves in? Can you trust that the world you are seeing through Henry's eyes is an accurate depiction of reality? These are not things I'm reading too far into for the sake of originally hoping this game was psychological horror. No, these things have accurate backing behind them. Delilah is a bit of a drunk. Henry called Delilah one night thinking he was talking to Julia at home. Delilah says she sees someone at Henry's tower as I was watching the tower and no one came from it. The groundwork for one or both of these characters to be unreliable in their narration is there, and it makes for the second act of the game to be unbelievably tense and scary. There were sections where Henry and Delilah's paranoia was rubbing off on me, and I was constantly checking myself anytime I heard the slightest noise from the forest. But there's one problem. Firewatch isn't a white-knuckle, high-staked thriller. It's a story about Henry and Delilah learning a little bit more about themselves. The second act of the game keeps raising and raising the stakes, pumping blood through the veins of the players as they sneak into the science research site to uncover just what type of isolated science experiment they found themselves in. But none of this pays off to the same degree. The third act ends the game on a somber note of character development, and while the ending in and of itself isn't bad, it's almost impossible not to feel some pang of disappointment from it. The second act has set the stakes so insanely high, and the conclusion is unable to come even close to hitting those marks. The initial kick in the gut of finding Brian's body is rough, but then you realize the story is much more a human affair, and the large-scale plotline that you had wrapped your head around was much, much smaller than you thought. Not to mention, the character resolution, or lack thereof, leaves you with a bit of an empty feeling. The ending isn't bad, it just lacks a sense of closure. In my playthrough, Delilah left a more broken character than I found her. She had long relationship issues from messing up her relationship with Javier, and you could pick up that she might be using alcohol as a crutch to deal with the loneliness, both physically and emotionally, that she found herself in. The game sends her off with the death of Brian on her hands. She feels guilt over Brian, even knowing full well that she shouldn't. The weight of Brian's death is too heavy for her to come back again in the summer. She now has to plot out a new, uncertain course for her life. If the journey of Firewatch tells us that Delilah is a broken person, then the ending leaves her shattered. There's no sense of resolution for her. She does not walk away from the summer with a better understanding of her baggage. She may have gotten a couple things off her chest, but there's no happy or resolute ending for her. And the same could probably be said for Henry. It was quite obvious, even in the opening minutes, that Henry took the job to escape his situation with Julia. I played the game with this in mind, as I assumed that along the journey of Firewatch, Henry would have to come to terms with Julia's condition and what it meant for his marriage. But even with choosing Julia-focused dialogue, there was very little in dealing with Julia and her condition. It was brought up and discussed. Henry openly admits that he's running away and that he shouldn't be here, but it never really evolves. There is one scene that could maybe be used to see Henry moving forward and dealing with Julia's condition. After Henry gets the new radio, he can have a bit of a breakdown, wondering if everything that's happening is real or not. He thinks he may be suffering from the same early dementia that Julia is, theorizing that maybe there was something in the water where they lived. You can see him start to mentally crack under the pressure of paranoia. If this scene was used as a catalyst to help Henry see just how scared Julia must be in her world, he could perhaps come to better terms with being back with her and easing the difficulty of her life. Sadly, this scene isn't expounded upon like this, and we really don't get a strong sense of forward progress in Henry's conundrum with his wife. So when Julia says that Henry should just go back to Julia, you have to ask yourself just how much Henry learned during his journey. He realizes that he shouldn't be away from Julia, but he learns that in the opening days. It doesn't seem that learning about Brian's death or Ned's wishy-washy fatherhood affect his outlook on Julia. Much like how the game sends off Delilah with no sense of closure, I got the same feeling from Henry. I don't feel that his character really progressed far enough to leave me satisfied as the credits roll. Part of this is most likely due to having dialogue choices that influence how Henry acts and talks with Delilah, but I don't like that as an excuse. There was obviously a pathway of conversation choices that dealt with Julia, but that pathway did not have a constructive ending. I felt no desire to play the game and see if any other pathway would yield fruit. There's room for a path of flirty romance with Delilah, but who's to say that that doesn't have the same lackluster ending? I was too drained from the disappointment to want to go back and see. There is one plot hole, or maybe I should say puzzling plot segment, that I wanted to discuss. Why was the backpack with the Shoshone cave key left out and alarmed? The backpack and key must have been left there purposefully, as there was an alarm behind the backpack taped to the tree. This was no accident that it was left here. The only logical conclusion is that Ned is the one who left the backpack and alarmed it, for there would be no reason for the research team or the teen girls to ever do such a thing. This raises a question. Knowing that the body of his son is in the cave, why would Ned hide and alarm the key instead of just keeping it in his makeshift home? There are more plot inconsistencies that hinder the plot point, and even some that hinder the whole story. Henry finds the wave receiver earlier that night, so Ned would have to immediately realize the wave receiver is gone, run out to the area by Henry's tower, plant the alarm backpack in some sort of harebrained scheme to use this time to plant blackmail? He would still have to record the audio onto the tape and edit it to plant the blackmail. None of this makes sense. And then we have to ask what happens to the original research team. It's highly suspect that a research team would go make a camp with expensive equipment and then leave their camp in a half-disheveled state with the equipment turned on. Would there be no attempt to recover the scientific equipment? Also, if Brian took and hid Ned's climbing pythons, how did Brian die in a climbing accident? I guess Ned could have had some spares or something, but it's a plot point that doesn't match up. I know I'm asking a lot of questions, and I get that some of them are petty, but in Firewatch's heat of the moment, these discoveries seemed logical because we think there's some overarching conspiracy that we're thrown into. When the game shows its hand at the end, it's hard not to think back at some of these moments and question them. The plot inconsistencies further drive home the unfulfilling ending of the game. The ride is good, but only as long as it lasts. Would I still recommend Firewatch? Yes. The ending seriously takes a lot of wind out of the sails. But man, if you played this game blind and got swept up in the paranoia and the fear like I did, then it's all worth it. That said, if you went against my warnings and watched the whole video, or had the story spoiled for you some other way, I might think twice about playing this game. I don't think you can really have the best possible experience with Firewatch if you already know the plots. And while the character interaction is good, it's not enough to save the whole game, especially with the lackluster closure. Like I said before, Firewatch is a hell of a ride, but you're only going to enjoy it for as long as the ride lasts.